Hello and welcome to The Wrap, WRAL's political podcast. I am your host this week, Will Doran, here with my colleague Paul Spey. It is crunch time in the 2024 elections. End of October, elections coming up fast, and we have just been swamped with visits from presidential candidates and their surrogates. We are recording this on Friday, and today alone, we've had Barack Obama in Charlotte. We've had First Lady Jill Biden all over the state.
Cary and Fayetteville both.
And Asheville, too, I believe.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
She made 3 stops. Cary, Fayetteville,
that's hard to keep up with.
Asheville. And then just outside of Fayetteville, in Rayford, we had JD Vance,
right.
Trump's running mate. So it has been just a full court press. And it really, I don't know that there has been a single day in the last 2 or 3 weeks that someone affiliated with one of these presidential campaigns has not been holding a rally somewhere in North Carolina.
Right. It's such a close state. Among the closest of all the swing states, if we look at the 2020 election results, ours was decided by 75,000 votes. It went for Trump, but I think of all the swing states, we had the closest margin, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, we were the closest Trump state. I think Georgia had a narrower margin. Georgia was the closest Biden state. We were the closest Trump state. So,
thank you for fact checking me. Yes,
there you go.
I remembered something about it, but obviously not the full context. But yeah, it's and this won't be the last. I'm sure there's going to be another full court press next week. I remember back in 2016, Hillary Clinton was here the night either before the election or the night of the election at NC State, just down the road. I think she was with Lady Gaga. So who knows what else we'll see in this next 10 days? Yeah,
it could be pretty wild. But one thing that's been floated, including today by the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is the group in Congress of kind of the hardline Republicans, the Lauren Boeberts and Mark Meadows is, he former North Carolina Congressman Mark Meadows, kind of an original founding member of that group. The current head of it, Andy Harris from Maryland, said that North Carolina maybe shouldn't even bother doing an election for president this year, pointed to the storm damage from Helene out west, which, as people probably know, Western North Carolina is a deeply conservative area that's kind of a Republican stronghold. There are plenty of counties out there that voted, 70-30, 75-25 for Trump in 2020. He said because of all that damage, don't even bother counting the votes. If it looks like Kamala Harris is winning North Carolina, just go ahead, somehow have Republican state lawmakers try to intervene and give the state's electoral college votes to Trump no matter what.
Right. And this, we should point out, comes about a week after Michael Flynn and some of his right-wing allies also came to North Carolina and at an event talked about potentially, having their electors in place.
That exact scenario.
Right, that exact scenario. So, while some people have dismissed it like, oh, this is a far-fetched idea, there's more than one person saying it, including a sitting congressman now.
Yeah, Michael Flynn was Trump's first director of national intelligence. We have the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is a pretty powerful group in Congress. So, these aren't exactly, fringe players. But our colleague Monica Casey was at the JD Vance rally in Rayford today, and Monica actually got a chance to ask him a question, and we asked her to ask about this thing that Andy Harris has said with, just throwing out any votes for Harris and just having Trump win no matter what. And Vance shot that idea down. Mm-hmm. He said, no, that's not what we need to be talking about. What we need to be talking about is making sure that every North Carolinian is able to vote. We need to make sure that everyone who wants to vote is able to vote and just take it from there. And this kind of lines up, I think, with a call that you were on today with Karen Brinson-Bell, who's the leader of the State Board of Elections.
Right. First, before we pivot, there was one other reaction that I found pretty humorous, and that was from Republican Congressman Patrick McHenry. When he heard this idea, he just said, bless his heart. that he's not aware of what's happening on the ground there.
Obviously. And he represents parts of Western North Carolina.
Correct. And so, the bless his heart, I think a lot of people know what that means. And he mentioned what's going on the ground. That's what State Elections Board Director Karen Brinson Bell talked about today. She talked about a lot of the progress they'd made. For instance, when they initially surveyed the damage, they thought on Election Day they would need 15 makeshift tents, set up at different sites to replace others that had been damaged too much. Now they think they will only need 7. So they've cut that number in half. Meanwhile, for early voting sites, which are open as we speak, they were able to open 76 of the 80 sites out there in those Helene-affected areas. So progress is being made. They're doing better than she said they thought they would.
Well, I mean, we've all seen those videos from Western North Carolina and roads completely washed away, buildings completely washed away. I mean, just the fact that those voting sites didn't happen to be among the places that were destroyed is, frankly lucky. And then, just the state's response in getting these roads reopened so that people can actually get to, the local libraries or churches or, anywhere else that they're having these election sites has been pretty, quick on the uptake here.
And Speaker Tim Moore, Republican, powerful Republican here in the legislature, talked about that yesterday too, and how difficult it is for some people to even get to voting sites because, he says, say you're 1 mile away from where you need to go. That's not like going down the street here in Raleigh. You got to go if you have to go around the mountain. That's 10 minutes. It's not 1 mile here is
switchback.
Right, and so he applauded the effort, but also spoke to the difficulties that some people are facing to cast their ballots. So far, Brinson Bell, the elections board director, said that the turnout in those hurricane-affected areas is better than the state's turnout rate overall. This morning for the entire state, it was 29%. And out in the 25 counties that are disaster areas, it was just barely above that. It was 30%. And so these are things.
Which is pretty shocking, the fact that
I was just about to say, when we first saw this damage, you couldn't fathom that. And now here they are turning out at great rates. And we can talk, they're in some places like Henderson, where which was also affected. There was a voting site. There have been such long lines that state lawmakers felt the need to address it earlier this week.
Yeah, there were 2 different Helene-related bills that the legislature passed pretty quickly on Thursday. I mean, it was just 1 day in and out, get it done. One was a big money bill, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the other one was an elections bill, and it was to put more early voting sites into McDowell and Henderson counties. And, those are 2 very pro-Trump counties, as is most of Western North Carolina. It's also places where they've had a lot of complaints about wait times or, concerns that people might not be able to get to it. I will note we had heard that, in Henderson County, they were processing people in like 8 to 10 minutes. Once you actually got in line at the place to go vote, you're only going to have to wait about 10 minutes, which is not bad at all. But the complaint, it seemed, had been that it was like 40 minutes or an hour to even get into the parking lot because they just didn't have enough spaces. Because that has been the reaction from this community of people really wanting to get out and vote. So, I think credit goes absolutely to the people of Western North Carolina exercising their civic duty here.
It's been so impressive. Not just the people who show up to vote, but the people who are volunteering and getting everything done out there. Obviously, there's certain logistical challenges that create lines they can't really help, and that's another thing. So, state lawmakers with their elections bill, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. Since you wrote about this, are forcing Henderson County to open 2 or 3 more voting sites to address meet demand out there. Brinson Bell in her call today, she didn't say that was a bad decision. She just said it was going to be difficult to open up those sites and have to find sites that are ADA compliant, accessible to people with disabilities, that are secure, that have good enough parking, and then getting people trained fast enough to go out there and process and do this process of inviting people to vote and checking off their names and getting them the proper ballots and all that. So we'll see whether they can actually get those extra sites open in time to have early voting. So it's
an uphill challenge,
right? There's there's still some tension here between people who want more sites for people to vote at, and the board saying, or at least Brinson Bell saying, we're going as fast as we can. We still got to have some safeguards in place and meet, state requirements and that for these sites. And so we'll see. Who knows what will end up happening or how many places will end up opening, but they're still working on it.
Well, and the whole debate at the legislature was a little bit funny to me because you had Republicans saying we need to make it as easy as possible to vote, which is normally the opposite of what you hear from Republicans. And then you had Democrats saying, oh, we have some concerns about election security if we go forward with this, which is normally the line that you hear from Republicans. So it was a little bit of everything turned up on its head. But
so funny. Politics is like that, though.
Yep. Well, like we said, that was not the only Helene-related bill the legislature took up. They also voted to spend hundreds of millions of dollars more. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back, and we'll dive into some of those details. Stick around. And we're back. Thanks for listening to the wrap. Big money for Hurricane Helene relief being approved by the state legislature this week, but at the same time, only a small portion of what Governor Roy Cooper had called for.
Well, let's start first with the estimated the amount of damages that his office has estimated. I believe it was $53 billion in damages from Helene to western North Carolina, which is, as someone who doesn't have that kind of money, very hard to imagine.
Some of these numbers, it just kind of, you're like, okay, what's the difference between 20 billion and 50 billion? At that point, it's, just a...
Right.
It all seems almost made up because it's so huge. But,
right.
I mean, one of the worst storms in North Carolina, certainly in recent history before Helene, was Florence in 2018. And that caused $17 billion in damage. And I believe that was a record at the time. Maybe some past storms like Fran or Floyd would have done more adjusted for inflation. But this is triple what Hurricane Florence did just 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. You don't really need to adjust that much.
And so this week, they've already, we should say, what we'll talk about now is what lawmakers are doing to address that. They've already passed one disaster relief bill. This week, they passed another.
Right.
And Roy Cooper proposed another. And so here we have a Democratic governor, and then we have a legislature where Democratic governor, Republican supermajority in the legislature. So they can pass whatever they want. They don't really need Cooper. But Cooper proposed a bill that would have spent $3.9 billion. What did lawmakers actually spend? They directed $600 million, not billion, from the rainy day fund to Helene recovery efforts. And so and Cooper, of course, signed it the next day. Of course, it was unanimous. There was no objections.
Right,
to the bill
like
itself,
but he's not going to block it.
The only objections were that it did not go far enough, but no one was going to stop this from going forward to try to get more. Where they all said, help needs to get there as fast as possible. But in floor speeches on Thursday, Democrats said time is of the essence. Businesses are closing. They're running out of money. People are getting eviction notices even when they probably shouldn't, or there's nothing they can do, to pay their rent. And so Democrats said the bill Republicans wrote didn't go far enough.
Yeah, just to kind of peel back some of the process here, you mentioned that they had previously spent about, I think it was $273 million in the initial relief bill that was, just a week or two after the storm hit. And most of that money just went toward like the very basic, paying overtime to all of the state workers who had been sent out there to clear roads and direct traffic and do search and rescue and everything else. And then also to start paying some like matching funds to get federal grant money. Mm-hmm. So it was just kind of the very basic sort of stuff. This bill was going to be, or is, much more targeted. Say, okay, we have these specific needs. Now that, it's been about a month, we actually know what happened, what needs to get responded to. Let's figure out how we're going to come in and respond to that. So Cooper laid out his $4 billion plan, $3.9 billion plan. And a lot of it was focused on a mix of loans and grants for businesses and farmers. That was probably a third to a half of it, was just trying to, help people rebuild their houses or help businesses not shut down. And, people who've been paying attention to North Carolina politics for a while know that Cooper has been under a lot of criticism for the very slow response that the state has had following both Matthew and Florence in 2016, 2018. There are still people who lost their homes in those storms or had their homes damaged in those storms who haven't had their homes rebuilt.
Right.
And, there's, Cooper will say, well, that's the federal government's fault. FEMA's being too slow. Republicans say, no, that's Cooper's fault. The state has screwed it up. No matter who you blame, the fact of the matter is it's been 6 or 8 years. People are still living in these damaged homes or having to live somewhere else because their home is gone, and they're just waiting on the government to help them out. So Cooper said, we need to kind of take some lessons from that and kickstart it. So he proposed, I think it was $300 or $400 million in his plan, would go towards housing relief and just getting ahead of FEMA, saying, people will probably get FEMA money eventually, but in the meantime, since that process could take a few years, we're just going to do it ourselves.
That's one of the things that was in his bill, but not in the Republicans' bill that actually passed. Right. Is housing relief. It also called for something like, I'm going to get this wrong because it's not in front of me, but I think it was $50 million for like mental health support. The Republican bill included $5 million for mental health support, but only for people, for students and employees and faculty in public schools who were affected.
Right. Yeah. Cooper called for that, for like one program for mental health programs in local schools, and then a broader, bigger mental health program for everybody.
Right. And so his ideas were either pared back in the Republican bill or not included at all. And one thing we asked Senate Leader Phil Berger and House Speaker Tim Moore about it on Thursday, and asked, is this why not include some of these things? And they said, is this a rebuke of Cooper? Is this politics? And they actually said, the answer surprised me. They said not necessarily. They said, Phil Berger said, we're open to any idea, including some in his plan. We asked him, is there anything that you won't do in his plan? And they said, they didn't see anything they would reject outright. And so their bill should not be considered a rebuke of Cooper's proposal. And they said there's some things they want to wait and see on because depending on the topic here, the federal government, if they go in first, it's better to do that for reimbursement purposes for the state government. But in other cases, for instance, you mentioned Cooper proposing grants for farmers and other business owners. Phil Berger said, we historically have not done grants. They've just done loans, and that's what they did this time. We
want to get that money back.
Right. We want to get some of that. And of course, I think the interest rates are pretty low. They're friendly to the businesses. But when we asked Berger and Moore about that, they said, maybe we could do something like that. We'll see. People will talk about the PPP loans from the pandemic. Those were federal funds that were distributed by the state, they pointed out. And so the state itself has never created a grant program for businesses affected by the storm. But we'll see. They're going to come back in November after the election and maybe pass another bill. Speaker Moore said he believes this will be the issue that they continue to talk about and continue to crunch numbers on. I think he said for the foreseeable future. It's possible that every time they do a budget for the next couple of years, it includes funding, additional funding, more and more funding for people out in Western North Carolina, because this was, for them, what do they call it, 100,000-year storm? I mean, it's something that they're going to talk about for months, if not years to come.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This should not be seen as the final word from the legislature on this. I mean, I've been covering budgets here in North Carolina for years, and we're still seeing, money getting spent, new funds getting appropriated to, fix, school campuses out east that were damaged in, some of these previous hurricanes years ago. So yeah, I mean, it would not be shocking at all to see, a budget in 2027, 2030 dealing with the fallout from Helene, because it was just so massive.
Right.
$53 billion in losses. And I should note, no one says that the government is going to be paying for all of that $53 billion. Insurance will cover some of it,
right.
But most people out west didn't have flood insurance. A lot of businesses didn't have flood insurance either.
That was another thing that Republicans said, and we should point out, again, this bill was unanimous and people were very cordial and mostly understanding. But, in response to Democratic critics who said the bill should have gone further, Senator Ralph Heiss, who chairs the powerful Appropriations Committee.
And who is from Spruce Pine and Mitchell County, one
right.
of the most hard-hit places in the entire state.
He got up and said something like, I'm paraphrasing here, like, we could shut down the government for 2 years and still not be able to pay for all of these damages. We can't, he said, the government can't do it. We don't have the money. The rainy day fund, I think, had about $4.4 or $4.7 billion. I can't remember which it was, but it was $4 billion. That doesn't begin to cover these damages.
Right,
and so they're saying
$53 billion.
Right. And these are fiscal conservatives who've been running the state for over a decade now, almost 15 years. And they've been, very fiscally responsible. They've built up this rainy day fund. They can't cover it. They said, don't look to the state to solve all these problems. We simply can't.
Yeah. So, some aid is coming also from the federal government. The federal government is expected to pay out a lot more money than the state will. They'll probably end up paying $14-15 billion, but again, that's only a fraction of the 53 that, has been estimated. So, a lot of businesses are probably going to need to close down. People may end up leaving the areas. I will note that one thing that the legislature did that Cooper had also recommended in his bill was just to send money directly to these counties and basically just acknowledge that businesses are going to be shutting down. People are going to be leaving the communities, and they're not going to be making as much money in taxes as they had anticipated. And so you don't want that to spiral out of control and, have a county government forced to cut education funding. And then that causes even more people to leave the county. That is the last thing that people want to have happen here. So even though there was a lot of disagreement there, I do want to note that one area of agreement of just getting some cash straight to these counties. A lot of them, pretty rural, pretty small counties, not very rich to start off with, just to make sure that the coming hit that everyone knows is going to happen isn't quite as bad.
Well, there are so many problems to address. On one hand, you have pollution in the rivers there because of all this. On the other hand, you have schools that have been damaged. When are the kids going to get back? You got to rebuild some of these schools. And then you have other infrastructure like roads and government buildings and businesses. And it's like, I don't know what you do if you're, say, a county manager or a city manager, the people that are in charge of the budgets in these places, because there's so much to consider. And if people are looking for a glimpse at just how bad it is, I saw we're running on WRAL. There's a digital documentary that NBC News did on Chimney Rock, and I caught a glimpse of some of that footage. It looks like a war zone.
Yeah. It is bad out there, but some steps being made to improve things. Like we said, this is probably not the final step. So we will let people know more when there is more to know. But for now, that is it. Thank you for listening, and catch us next time. Only a few more days till the election.
That's right.
It's coming down to the wire. Go vote if you haven't already.